She was no more than 15 years old, a girl whose gentle spirit shone brighter than the morning sun over the fields. Her name carried the softness of rain, and her eyes reflected the calmness of rivers that wound through the valley. From dawn until dusk, she worked with quiet diligence, her small hands carrying burdens far greater than her years. Yet no complaint passed her lips. She greeted every task with patience, every wound of the heart with silence, and every harsh word with the balm of kindness. The villagers often noticed her passing. Though clothed in the simplest garments and often covered in dust, she walked with a grace that seemed untouchable by sorrow. Her life was not easy, for she lived in the shadow of a stepmother whose heart had hardened long ago. While the stepmother favored her own children with food, affection, and words of praise, the girl was treated as little more than a servant in her own home. She rose earlier than the others, fetching water from the river while the sky was still gray, her bare feet pressing into the cool earth. By the time the household stirred, she had already gathered firewood, swept the yard, and prepared food that she was seldom allowed to taste. Her stomach often grumbled in protest, but she smiled faintly, convincing herself that one day her patience would not be in vain. Despite the harshness she endured, her heart remained pure. She shared what little she had with children in the village who had less than her, saving crumbs from her meals or weaving small toys out of palm fronds to make them laugh. When elders passed by, she lowered her head respectfully, carrying herself with humility that earned their silent admiration. Some whispered that she was touched by the ancestors, that her strength came not from this world but from something higher, something unseen. Her stepmother, however, saw none of this goodness. She saw only a rival to her children, a girl whose beauty and grace threatened to outshine her own blood. Where others saw innocence, the stepmother saw danger. Where others admired kindness, the stepmother seethed with jealousy. And so, day after day, she sharpened her cruelty like a blade, cutting away at the girl's spirit with cold commands and unearned punishments. Yet the girl endured, meeting every blow with silence, every insult with lowered eyes, every burden with determination. The girl's daily life reflected both her suffering and her resilience. When she worked in the fields, she would hum softly, her songs carrying across the rows of maize and easing the laborers nearby. At the riverbank, as she filled her calabash with water, she would pause to admire her reflection rippling in the current, not with vanity but with quiet wonder, as if searching for the person she was destined to become. In the evenings, after every chore was completed, she would sit alone under the great baobab tree, whispering her dreams to the stars. She longed not for riches or fine clothes but for love, freedom, and the respect that every human soul deserved. The contrast between her gentle nature and her stepmother's coldness could not have been sharper. The stepmother's voice, harsh and cutting, echoed through the house, while the girl's voice was soft, often used to soothe crying children or comfort animals. The stepmother's eyes, hard as stone, gleamed with suspicion and malice, while the girl's eyes reflected compassion, always searching for goodness even where none seemed to exist. One was fueled by greed and bitterness, the other by kindness and hope. The house became a battlefield of spirits, one determined to destroy, the other determined to endure. Though the girl never spoke of her pain, the villagers noticed. They saw how thin she had grown, how her hands bore calluses from endless work, how her shoulders slumped under invisible weights. Yet they also saw how she still managed to smile at the smallest joys, a bird singing in the morning, a child's laughter, or the way the wind carried the scent of flowers through the air. That ability to find light in the midst of darkness set her apart. Even those who turned a blind eye to her suffering could not deny that her presence carried an unexplainable peace. At times, she wondered why her fate had been woven with such cruelty. She lay awake at night, staring at the roof of the hut, her body aching from labor, her mind drifting to dreams of escape. She imagined a life where she was treated as more than a shadow, where she could speak without fear and laugh without scorn. She dreamed of a place where her worth was seen, where love did not come with conditions and where her chains, though not yet physical, would one day break. These dreams became her secret refuge, fueling her spirit when her body was exhausted. The girl's innocence was not weakness, though her stepmother mistook it for such. It was strength, quiet, enduring, unyielding. Every time she forgave instead of hating, every time she endured instead of breaking, she built within herself a power her enemies could not comprehend. It was this unseen power, hidden beneath her gentle demeanor, that would one day turn the tide of her life. For though her stepmother believed she could bind her with cruelty and erase her with chains, the girl's spirit had already been claimed by something far greater than human malice, the justice of destiny itself. The stepmother's cruelty was not born overnight, It grew slowly like thorns creeping around a tender flower. At first it was subtle, almost invisible to those outside the household. She would pass the girl over when food was served, pretending to forget her portion, or she would hand her the smallest scraps left after everyone else had eaten. The girl, too gentle to protest, accepted the crumbs with a quiet smile, though her stomach often cried for more. These small denials were the beginning, each act of spite feeding the bitterness that brewed in the stepmother's heart. Her envy was a constant fire that smoldered beneath her calm exterior. She envied the girl's beauty, which seemed to blossom despite hunger and hardship. While her own daughters were pampered with oils and beads, their faces grew sharp with arrogance, their laughter brittle and shallow. Yet the girl, dressed in rags and smeared with dust from endless labor, shone with a natural grace that even the harshest life could not dim. When she walked through the village, eyes followed her, not out of pity but admiration. Young men whispered about her kindness, elders spoke of her humility, and children clung to her hand as though she carried comfort itself. These whispers reached the stepmother's ears like poison, stirring jealousy that she tried and failed to contain. Her fear ran deeper still. Some said the ancestors marked the girl for greatness, that her suffering was only the soil from which destiny would grow. The stepmother, sharp enough to sense the truth of it, feared being overshadowed. What if one day the girl rose above her children, outshining them not only in beauty but in wisdom and honor? What if her name became a song on the villagers' lips, while her own children faded into silence? That thought gnawed at her pride until it became unbearable. As the fire of envy grew, her cruelty sharpened. She began setting impossible tasks for the girl, designed not to test her skill but to break her spirit. At dawn she would order her to fetch water from the river 3 times before sunrise, knowing the path was long and the buckets heavy. By noon, she demanded the fields be weeded and the house swept until it gleamed. By evening, she ordered her to pound grain long after her arms ached with fatigue. If the girl slowed, she was scolded. She faltered, she was struck. If she succeeded, no word of praise was given, only harsher commands for the next day. The stepmother's bitterness found its way into every corner of the girl's life. When the girl tried to rest under the shade of the baobab tree, the stepmother would appear, accusing her of idleness and dragging her back to work. When she hummed to herself at the riverbank, the stepmother scolded her for making noise like a child. Even her smiles became targets of ridicule, as though joy itself was an offense. The girl learned to hide her happiness, keeping her laughter inside like a secret flame. The stepmother's daughters, emboldened by their mother's example, joined in the cruelty. They mocked the girl's torn clothes, calling her a servant rather than a sister. They pushed chores onto her shoulders, boasting that they were too fine to soil their hands. At mealtimes, they laughed as she waited until they finished, scraping the bottom of the pot for what was left. Their arrogance grew while the girl's silence deepened. Yet her silence was not weakness, it was the stillness of a storm biding its time. Foreshadowing her greater betrayal, the stepmother began to speak in whispers with her neighbors, twisting words to make the girl appear cursed. She brings misfortune, she claimed when storms ruin the crops. Her presence steals blessings meant for others. Though most villagers did not believe her, the seeds of suspicion took root. The girl noticed the way some avoided her gaze, the way whispers followed her footsteps. Though her heart ached, she kept walking with her head low, refusing to let slander steal her dignity. In the privacy of the hut, the stepmother's schemes grew darker. She kept her plans hidden even from her own daughters, but her eyes betrayed her thoughts, sharp, calculating, filled with malice. She watched the girl constantly, searching for a weakness to exploit. Sometimes she muttered under her breath about chains and punishment, words that the girl overheard but could not fully understand. A chill would run down her spine when she caught her stepmother staring at her too long, as though measuring her not as a daughter but as prey. Small cruelties began to hint at what was coming. One evening, the stepmother tied a rope loosely around the girl's wrists, laughing that she looked like a goat ready for the market. Another time, she locked her in the storage hut for an hour, claiming it was punishment for spilling water, though the spill had been caused by her own daughter. Each time the girl endured, though fear flickered in her chest. She began to sense that her stepmother's bitterness was not content with daily humiliations. It sought something final, something irreversible. The girl's innocence, however, never wavered. Even in the face of cruelty, she prayed silently for her stepmother's heart to soften. She hoped, against all reason, that kindness might someday return to the woman who had raised her. Yet fate had already set its course. The stepmother's envy had grown too wild, her bitterness too sharp. The small acts of cruelty were only shadows of the betrayal that lay ahead, a betrayal that would call forth powers the stepmother could neither control nor escape. The stepmother's heart had become a vessel of envy so poisonous that even her breath carried bitterness. Each day, she watched the girl move about the compound with a gentleness that seemed to mock her own hardened soul. Every act of kindness, every soft smile the girl offered to others, felt like an insult, as though the world itself had chosen to love the girl and forget her. In her dark thoughts, she convinced herself that the girl's beauty and innocence were dangerous, threatening the place she wanted to secure for her own children. This was not just ordinary jealousy, it was a consuming fear that the girl's quiet spirit would one day outshine her authority and undo the power she held over the household. At first, her cruelty had been subtle. A skipped meal here, a heavier task there, small humiliations disguised as discipline. But as the days wore on, the bitterness inside her became unbearable, and she longed for a way to silence the girl once and for all. In the corners of her mind, a thought began to form, dark and heavy like a storm cloud. Chains. Not just any punishment, not a beating or scolding that might pass with time, but something meant to break the girl's spirit forever. The very image of shackles, cold, merciless, unyielding, pleased her, for chains did not simply restrain, they declared ownership. They spoke of enslavement and humiliation. To see the girl bound like a prisoner would feed the hunger of her envy and satisfy her thirst for dominance. She began to whisper her plan in secret. At first, she dared only to mutter to herself in the night, as though speaking it aloud might summon unseen ears. But soon she sought the assistance of others. There were a few in the village who, though not cruel, were fearful of her sharp tongue and harsher punishments. With a twisted smile, she convinced them that the girl was cursed, that her strange resilience and beauty were signs of hidden powers that must be subdued. Fear, she knew, was a powerful tool, and so she painted the girl as a danger rather than a victim. Some villagers, caught between pity for the girl and fear of the stepmother's wrath, chose silence. Others, eager to avoid becoming targets themselves, nodded and agreed to her bidding. The stepmother took care in her preparations. She selected chains that were not only strong but carried symbolic weight. They were old, iron links once used to bind cattle or drag heavy stones, the kind that bore the smell of rust and the memory of hardship. To her, these chains were perfect. Not only would they hold the girl's body, but they would also declare to the village that she was less than human, a beast to be subdued. She hid them beneath cloth and straw, waiting for the right moment, savoring the anticipation of her cruelty. Her accomplices, though reluctant, followed her commands. At night, she whispered instructions: how the girl was to be cornered, how the chains would be fastened, how no one must intervene. The villagers who overheard her plotting turned away, choosing to believe it was not their place to interfere. In their silence, the stepmother found her power magnified. Each day, as the girl worked tirelessly, her stepmother watched with a sinister gleam in her eyes, knowing that soon those gentle hands, those kind eyes, that innocent spirit would be weighed down and silenced by cold iron. But as she plotted, the winds of fate began to stir, unseen yet present. The stepmother, blinded by her envy, failed to notice how the night air grew restless when she spoke her cruel plans, or how the old chains sometimes groaned as though resisting their intended purpose. She thought she was weaving a trap of iron and secrecy, but in truth she was weaving the first threads of her own downfall. The day of bondage came with the deceptive brightness of morning, as though the world itself had no knowledge of the cruelty that was about to unfold. The girl woke as she always did, quietly and dutifully, rising before the sun had fully spread its gold across the horizon. She moved with her usual grace, carrying water from the stream, sweeping the compound, preparing to grind grain, all the while unaware that every step brought her closer to the trap that had been set. Her heart was light in spite of her burdens, for she had learned to find small comforts in simple things: the sound of birdsong, the play of shadows on the earth, the rhythm of her own hands at work. But her stepmother's eyes, sharp and watchful, followed her with a predator's hunger, waiting for the moment to strike. The plan was cruel in its precision. The stepmother had gathered her accomplices, her own children and a few others who had bowed to her influence, and given them clear instructions. They were to surround the girl at just the right time, using deceit and force to subdue her. The chains had been hidden in a woven basket, covered with cloth, so they appeared to carry nothing more than household tools. To the unsuspecting girl, it seemed like an ordinary day. She did not sense the tension in the air, nor the way the stepmother's smile was too thin, too sharp. It began with a lie. One of the stepmother's children called her, pretending urgency, saying something had been spilled in the storehouse and she was needed at once. Concerned as always and eager to be helpful, The girl obeyed without hesitation, her bare feet hurrying across the dusty ground. But when she stepped inside, the door was slammed shut behind her. In an instant, shadows moved around her, hands grabbing, voices shouting in harsh tones. Startled, she tried to pull away, confusion flashing in her wide eyes. "What is this?" she cried, her voice trembling, though still soft with disbelief. But no answer came, only the cruel laughter of her stepmother, who entered with the basket. With a theatrical flourish, she drew out the iron chains, their clinking echoing like a sinister song in the enclosed space. The girl's breath caught as she saw them, her body frozen between fight and surrender. Fear flooded her chest, sharp and suffocating, yet deep inside an ember of dignity still glowed. When the first cold link touched her skin, she gasped as though bitten by frost. The weight pressed onto her wrists and ankles, heavy and unyielding. She struggled, twisting against their grip, her heart pounding with panic. Tears welled in her eyes, not from weakness but from the shock of betrayal, for these were her own kin, people she had once hoped might offer her kindness. Each tug of the chain stole a fragment of her freedom, and with every tightening link she felt her breath grow shorter. The stepmother, reveling in her cruelty, declared loudly to those gathered, "Now she will know her place. No more will her beauty and her softness deceive the world. She is nothing but a burden, and I will see her treated as such." Her words dripped with venom, and her accomplices laughed nervously, their voices mingling with the rattling of the chains. They celebrated the sight of her bound, clapping their hands, jeering at her helplessness. The girl, though overwhelmed by fear, did not beg. Her silence unsettled them even as it angered her stepmother. She lowered her eyes, feeling the cold iron pressing into her skin, and though her body trembled, her spirit whispered quietly within her, reminding her that this humiliation was not the end. Shock rippled through her like waves, fear crashed against her heart, yet beneath it all, there was something else, an unbroken core of strength she herself did not yet recognize. Outside the storehouse, villagers passed by, hearing muffled noises but choosing not to interfere. Some suspected what was happening, but fear of the stepmother's wrath kept them from acting. They told themselves it was not their business, yet unease prickled at their consciences. A few paused, staring at the shut door, sensing the injustice, but quickly walked away. The chains clanged again, sealing the girl's fate for the moment, while her enemies rejoiced in their triumph. The stepmother lifted her chin high, satisfaction glowing in her cruel eyes. "Now," she said with finality, "she will serve as I wish, bound and broken." And with that, the girl was dragged into the open, the sun glaring down as if to witness her humiliation. Dust clung to her tear-streaked face, the iron around her wrists glinting in the harsh light. The oppressors cheered as though victory had been won, blind to the truth that their celebration was the beginning of their downfall. The night of suffering descended slowly, the sky shifting from gold to purple to an oppressive black, until even the moon seemed hesitant to shine. The girl sat bound in her chains, the cold metal digging into her tender skin, each movement scraping raw wounds onto her wrists and ankles. She had been thrown aside like an animal, left on the bare ground of a hut that smelled of dust and neglect. Her body was weary from the long day of betrayal and bondage, but the ache in her soul was heavier still. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, for she had been denied food since the morning. Her lips were dry, her throat parched, yet she could not bring herself to cry out for water, for she knew it would only draw cruel laughter from those who had put her here. Tears slipped down her cheeks quietly, glistening faintly in the dim light that leaked through the cracks in the hut's walls. She thought of her life before this day, the time she had laughed softly to herself while carrying water, the way her heart once lifted at the sound of birdsong. Those moments now felt like distant memories stolen away by the weight of chains. She whispered broken words into the silence, prayers carried on her shallow breath. "Spirits, ancestors, whoever hears me," she murmured, "do not let my soul be crushed." Her voice was weak, but her intent was strong, each whispered plea a thread of light in the surrounding darkness. Her solitude was unbearable at first, the kind that pressed down upon her chest and made every second stretch endlessly. She thought of her stepmother's face twisted with cruelty, of the laughter that had surrounded her humiliation. Pain surged through her chest, not just from betrayal but from the sharp injustice of it all. She was guilty of no crime. She had harmed no one. And yet here she sat, chained like a criminal, treated as though she was less than human. The knowledge burned like fire in her veins, but beneath the fire was also something unexpected, a seed of strength beginning to stir. The hunger twisted deeper, her stomach clenching painfully, but instead of breaking her spirit, it forced her inward, into a place where her will had always lived, hidden and waiting. She began to recall the teachings of her late mother, soft words spoken long ago. The world may turn against you, but remember, the spirits of truth and justice never abandon the innocent. She closed her eyes, clutching at the memory like a lifeline. As exhaustion pulled at her body, her mind drifted into a strange space between waking and dreaming. It was there that she began to sense the presence of something greater. Whispers echoed faintly around her, not from human lips, but from unseen forces. At first they sounded like the wind slipping through cracks, but soon they took on rhythm and tone, voices older than time itself. She could not make out all their words, yet their presence brought an odd calm, as though the darkness itself had shifted to embrace her. Shadows moved lightly across the walls, not menacing but protective, as if forming a barrier between her fragile body and the cruelty waiting outside. Dreams came upon her in waves, vivid and strange. She saw visions of sand turning to rivers, chains melting into dust, and birds circling high above, their wings flashing like silver in the night. In one dream, a hand of light touched her shoulder, and though no face appeared, she felt a surge of reassurance. "Endure," the voice seemed to whisper, "for this night is not forever. The chains that bind you will bind your enemies." She woke with tears in her eyes, but they were no longer only of despair. They carried a quiet strength, a belief that something unseen had chosen to guard her. The hours dragged on, her body aching, her spirit wavering and then gathering again. She wept, but her tears fell with dignity, each one watering the seed of resilience growing inside her. Every clink of the chain reminded her of her suffering, but also of her will to endure. Hunger sharpened her senses, silence made her prayers louder in her own heart. And when the cold night wind finally swept through the cracks of the hut, brushing her cheeks, it felt less like cruelty and more like a promise, that she was not as alone as she seemed. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, her stepmother believed she had broken the girl's spirit. But within the girl, something else had taken root. Though her body remained chained, her soul was freer than ever before. Her suffering had become the soil where her inner strength awakened, watered by tears, guarded by whispers and sustained by hope. She knew her enemies would not understand it yet, but a truth had formed in her heart. Cruelty may bind the body, but it can never chain the spirit. The night after her long suffering stretched on, and though the girl's body was weak, her spirit remained anchored by the whispers she had heard in her half-dreams. She sat still, bound, her wrists raw and bleeding where the iron bit into her flesh. Every breath felt like a battle, yet within her heart a strange quietness had taken root. It was during one of these moments of stillness that she first noticed it, the faintest tremor running through the chains that held her. At first she thought it was her imagination, perhaps her tired muscles twitching, but when she grew still again, the sound persisted. A faint rattle, as though the metal itself had a heartbeat. The chains were heavy, forged not only of iron but of malice. They had been fastened with cruelty, each link intended to crush her freedom and spirit. But in the silence of that hut, where only shadows kept her company, she began to sense that these very chains were no longer entirely in her enemy's control. Once, they had tightened painfully with every small movement she made, biting deeper, but now they seemed to loosen just slightly when her prayers grew louder, as though the rhythm of her whispered words was teaching them to breathe. It was as though the spirits had decided to take hold of the very tools meant for her torment, twisting them toward another destiny. As the wind outside picked up, sliding dust through the cracks of the hut, the girl thought she saw something impossible. The faintest glow traced itself across the metal, not strong enough to light the room, but visible in the deep dark. The links shimmered as if reflecting firelight, though no flame burned nearby. She gasped softly, at first in fear, wondering if her eyes deceived her. Yet when she blinked, the glow remained, pulsing faintly in time with her own heartbeat. The more she gazed, the more it seemed as though the chains were alive, responding not to the will of her captors, but to hers. The rattling grew louder at times, especially when her mind drifted to her stepmother and the cruelty that had forced her into bondage. Each thought of injustice seemed to stir the metal, making it twitch and groan like a restless serpent. The girl, trembling, realized she was no longer entirely helpless. Though her body still ached, though her skin still bore the marks of cruelty, there was a force shifting around her, one that her stepmother had not foreseen. Chains may bind the body, but the spirits were weaving their own secret within them. She remembered her dream from the night before, where the voice had told her, "The chains that bind you will bind your enemies." At the time, she thought it was only a comfort, a fragile hope gifted by the spirits. But now, seeing the faint shimmer, hearing the restless clinking that moved even when she did not, she realized the dream had been more than just a dream. It had been a warning of what was to come, a promise of reversal. Her fear transformed slowly into awe. She leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes, listening carefully to the strange song of the rattling metal. It was no longer the sound of captivity, it was the sound of possibility. She imagined the spirits flowing through each link, bending the iron's will, undoing the malice woven into it. She imagined her stepmother's face, smug and cruel, and for the first time she did not feel crushed by that image. Instead, she felt a spark of strength, a knowing that these very chains would someday become her weapon of justice. The air in the hut grew colder as the night deepened. A gust of wind swept through a crack in the roof, carrying with it a sound like whispering voices. The girl did not know the language, yet she felt the words settle in her bones. The chains stirred again, louder this time, as if answering the whispers. She stared, wide-eyed, as the shackles at her ankles shifted, loosening for just a breath before tightening again. The spirits were showing her that power was building, gathering, but not yet ready to be released. She understood then that she must endure a little longer, for destiny was weaving something greater than she could yet imagine. Her heartbeat steadied, her breathing slowed, and even through the pain she felt the weight of her fate shift. Once she had believed the chains were her end, the cruel symbol of her stepmother's victory. Now she knew they were only the beginning, a vessel for something far larger. The metal links no longer seemed cold alone. They pulsed with a strange warmth, carrying within them the strength of unseen hands. Though dawn had not yet come, a light grew in her spirit, clear and unwavering. The chains rattled softly again, almost like a lullaby, and she smiled faintly through her tears. The girl who had been cast aside, bound in humiliation, was no longer only a victim. Her suffering had become a path to power, and her chains were no longer merely instruments of pain. They were alive, and they were waiting. The breaking point came not with warning but with a sudden force that shattered the night's silence. The girl had sat for hours in her dim prison, her body weak, her spirit clinging to the whispers of unseen forces, when the first crack of sound split the air. At first she thought it was thunder rolling in the distance, but the storm outside was still. The sound came again, sharper this time, the groan of metal under a pressure greater than any human hand could impose. Her chains trembled violently against her skin, the iron rattling like drums struck by invisible hands. She gasped, pulling back instinctively, though she knew it was not her strength that caused the movement. Something greater had awakened. The glow she had seen in the nights before now burned brighter, coursing along the chains like veins of molten fire. It started at her wrists, searing in color but not in pain, moving link by link as though life itself had entered the dead metal. Each clink echoed louder than the last until the hut seemed alive with the music of iron. Her heart pounded, fear and awe twisting together, but deep within she recognized the promise fulfilled. The spirits had not forgotten her cries. The first shackle gave way with a deafening crack. The chains snapped as though struck by lightning, the sound ringing into the night like a bell of judgment. The girl stumbled forward, her body unprepared for the sudden freedom, yet her spirit surged with energy that was not her own. Sparks of unseen power rippled through the air, stirring the dust on the floor, shaking the walls of the hut. She looked down at her freed wrist, disbelief flooding her eyes. The wound from the metal no longer bled. Instead, faint light glimmered along her skin, as though the chains had left her not with scars but with markings of destiny. Before she could catch her breath, the second shackle shattered. This time, the break was accompanied by a rush of wind that tore through the hut, slamming the door wide open. The night itself seemed to roar in answer, carrying with it the voices of spirits who had long awaited this moment. The girl raised her head, her tears drying in the sudden gale, and she knew this was not simply her release. This was judgment. Her stepmother, who had lingered nearby with her accomplices, burst into the hut at the sound. They had expected silence, the quiet victory of cruelty. Instead, they were met with a sight that froze their blood. The girl stood, still weak in body but blazing with an aura they could not comprehend, broken chains dangling from her arms. The shattered links rattled as if alive, moving without touch, swirling faintly in the air. The stepmother's face drained of color, her confident sneer collapsing into horror. She had bound the girl to silence, to humiliation, but the very weapons she had used were no longer hers to command. "What is this?" she shouted, her voice shrill, trembling between fear and disbelief. Her accomplices backed away, eyes wide, muttering prayers under their breath. They could feel it, the hut was no longer just a prison. It had become a place of reckoning where unseen powers had chosen sides. The chains clattered against the ground, yet they did not lie still. Instead, they writhed as if serpents awakening from slumber, clinking with menace. The stepmother stumbled backward, her cruel confidence unraveling into panic. She reached for the doorway, but the broken links snapped toward her with sharp, whip-like movements, forcing her back. Sweat poured down her face, her chest heaving as she realized her scheme had turned against her. The girl stood silently watching, her expression no longer of helplessness but of awe and quiet power. She did not command the chains, yet they moved as if they heard her spirit. Energy pulsed through the air, thick, electric, undeniable. The very atmosphere seemed to hum, making every hair on the skin of those present rise. The oppressor's mockery died in their throats. All they could hear now was the chorus of iron rattling with judgment. The stepmother's panic deepened into terror as she saw what no cruelty could explain. The girl she had chained for destruction had become the vessel of forces beyond her control. She had underestimated not only the resilience of innocence but the power that innocence could summon when wronged. The chains, meant to silence, had instead found their voice. And that voice spoke of vengeance. With one final surge, the last length of iron snapped free, shattering into fragments that spun wildly across the floor. The noise was deafening, like the roar of 100 storms colliding. Dust and sparks filled the air, and for a moment it seemed as though fire itself danced within the hut. When the echoes faded, the girl stood completely unbound, her arms free, her gaze steady. The stepmother's lips trembled as she whispered in disbelief, "This is not possible." But it was possible. The girl could feel it. The chains had not broken simply to free her. They had broken to announce the beginning of her enemy's downfall. And as the broken links slithered restlessly on the ground, circling like predators ready to strike, the stepmother finally understood. What she had built with hatred was now unraveling into her own doom. The moment the chains snapped from the girl's body, silence fell upon the village square. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one breathed. The chains that once bound her lay on the ground, coiled like serpents, rattling faintly as though alive. Then, before anyone could make sense of the miracle, the iron links stirred, slithering with unnatural intent. Slowly, steadily, they turned away from the girl and began moving toward her tormentors. The stepmother, who only moments ago stood triumphant, felt her knees weaken. She tried to step back, to command the villagers to stop this madness, but her voice faltered. The chains rose from the ground like angry spirits, writhing and hissing in the night air, and all eyes followed their movements with dread. One of the accomplices, the neighbor who had tied the girl's wrists earlier that day, let out a terrified scream and bolted, but he barely made it 3 paces before a chain lashed out and wrapped around his ankle. The crowd gasped as the man was yanked to the ground, dragged backward by a force he could not fight. The chain tightened mercilessly, binding his limbs together until he lay writhing in the dust. The stepmother shrieked for others to help, but the villagers only stood frozen, their fear rooted deeper than pity. No one dared to move. They had all seen what had happened. The chains were not obeying human will but something far greater, something divine. Another accomplice tried to hack at the links with a machete, his face twisted with panic, but as the blade struck, sparks flew and the iron writhed harder, twisting around his arms. The weapon slipped from his hands as the links climbed like living vines, pinning him against a tree. His screams echoed in the night, high-pitched and frantic, until the chain sealed around his chest and silenced him. The stepmother stumbled backward, her eyes darting wildly. "No, no. This is her doing," she shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the girl, who still stood wide-eyed but untouched, her body glowing faintly as if bathed in moonlight. The accusation rang hollow. Everyone could see the truth. This was no witchcraft, no trick. It was judgment. The chains slithered toward her now, slow and deliberate, as though savoring her fear. She turned to flee, her feet pounding against the earth, but the ground itself seemed to betray her. She tripped on a root and fell hard, the wind knocked from her lungs. Before she could rise, the chains coiled around her waist, pinning her arms to her sides. She screamed, thrashing, clawing at the iron, but the more she fought, the tighter it gripped. The villagers whispered among themselves, their voices low and trembling. Some muttered prayers, others crossed themselves or bowed their heads. They had seen cruelty before, but never retribution so swift, so unearthly. The stepmother writhed in the dust, her eyes wild with hatred and terror. "Help me," she cried out to the villagers. "I am your neighbor, your sister. Free me." But no one moved. They remembered the girl's silent suffering, the endless chores, the tears shed in secret. They remembered how the stepmother had laughed when the girl begged for mercy. Their silence was their judgment. The girl, still standing at the center of it all, watched with wide eyes. Her heart pounded with a storm of emotions, fear, sorrow, even pity, but beneath it all was a rising strength. She had prayed for deliverance, not vengeance, yet it seemed the two had become one. The spirits had chosen to answer her suffering with balance, to let the instruments of her bondage become the instruments of justice. The chains tightened around the stepmother, lifting her slightly from the ground. She shrieked, her face contorted with rage. "You will regret this, child," she spat, her voice breaking. But her threats dissolved into gasps as the chains squeezed, binding her tighter, immobilizing her completely. Around her the accomplices lay in similar states, bound, gagged, powerless. Their earlier jeers and cruelty had turned into pitiful whimpers. Some still fought weakly against their bindings, but it was useless. Every twist of their bodies only seemed to make the chains constrict further, as though feeding on their desperation. The villagers watched in awe, their fear slowly giving way to realization. This was no ordinary punishment. It was cosmic justice, justice that even the most powerful among them could not escape. An elder finally stepped forward, his voice trembling as he spoke. "The spirits have judged. These chains were forged for evil, but evil has returned to those who wielded it." His words settled heavily in the air and heads bowed all around. The girl lowered her gaze, tears streaming down her face, not of sorrow but of release. For the first time in years she felt the crushing weight of oppression lift from her shoulders. The chains no longer held her down. Instead, they had become her defenders, her shield. The stepmother continued to struggle, her screams turning into frantic sobs. She begged now, her pride shattered. "Please, forgive me. I was afraid. I only wanted—" But her words fell flat. They were not pleas born of repentance, but of desperation. Everyone knew it. The night grew still, save for the rattling of the chains as they settled into their new purpose, binding the guilty. The girl stepped forward, her trembling hands clasped together. She did not gloat nor smile. She only whispered a prayer of gratitude to the unseen forces that had answered her cries. The stepmother's eyes met hers, wide with terror. "Release me," she begged, her voice cracking. But the girl only shook her head gently. "It is not my hand that binds you," she said softly, her voice carrying an otherworldly calm. "And it will not be my hand that decides your fate." The villagers murmured in agreement. They understood then that the girl had become more than just a victim. She was now a symbol of purity tested and proven, chosen to reveal the truth of justice. The chains rattled once more, their metallic chorus echoing into the night, as though sealing the verdict. The enemies were trapped, not by the girl, not by human will, but by a justice greater than them all. The night air hung heavy with silence after the chains had sealed around the stepmother and her accomplices. Only the crackle of the village fire and the faint, rhythmic rattling of iron broke the stillness. At the center of it all stood the girl, barefoot, weary, her skin marked with bruises where the chains had once cut deep. Yet despite her scars, there was something different about her now. She did not stand as a victim but as someone reborn, her posture straighter, her eyes glowing with quiet strength. The villagers, who had watched from the shadows for so long, began to step forward. Mothers clutched their children closer, men bowed their heads, and the elders exchanged grave looks. They had seen cruelty before, but they had also seen mercy. What unfolded before them was neither the work of human hands nor ordinary chance. It was the hand of fate, of spirits, of justice itself. And in the center of that divine judgment stood the girl. At first no one spoke. They only looked at her with awe, as if unsure whether she was still the same girl who had carried buckets of water, swept their homes, and endured her stepmother's sharp tongue without complaint. She had been the quiet one, the obedient one, the one who bore cruelty in silence. But now she stood tall in the firelight, a figure of innocence proven and strength revealed. An elder finally broke the silence, stepping forward with a staff in hand. His voice was low, reverent. "Child, the chains that sought to break you have made you stronger. We were blind, but the spirits were not. You are free, and no one shall bind you again." The words rippled through the crowd, and a murmur of agreement followed. One by one, villagers began to bow their heads to her, not in worship but in respect. Some wept openly, ashamed that they had looked away when cruelty reigned in her home. Others whispered prayers of thanks that they had lived to see truth revealed. The girl lowered her gaze, tears welling in her eyes. Freedom was not loud. It was not the roar of triumph. It was quiet, like the gentle release of a weight long carried. She raised her hands slightly as if to steady herself and whispered, "I am free." The words trembled into the night air, and the villagers echoed them softly as if to make them real. The stepmother, bound tightly in chains, lifted her head with a sneer. Even in her humiliation, her pride refused to die. "Do not honor her," she spat, her voice trembling with both rage and fear. "She is nothing but a child. Do you not see how she deceives you? This is witchcraft, a curse meant to shame me." But no one listened. Her words, once sharp enough to wound the girl's spirit, now fell hollow against the air. The villagers had seen enough. They remembered how the girl had endured, how she had given kindness even when met with cruelty. They had heard her cries at night and seen the bruises on her hands, yet they had looked away. Now the truth lay plain before them, and the stepmother's voice carried no weight. The chains constricted tighter around the woman, silencing her screams. Some villagers shook their heads with pity, others turned away. Fate had chosen her punishment and no one would interfere. The girl, however, did not gloat. She did not look upon her stepmother with hatred, but with a sorrow deeper than anger. She knew that bitterness had eaten away at the woman's heart until there was nothing left but envy and cruelty. Now that same bitterness had become her undoing. "You chained me because you feared me," the girl said softly, her voice steady. "But what you feared was only your own shadow. I did nothing but live." The words cut through the air like a blade sharper than iron. The stepmother's head fell forward, her eyes burning with shame. The villagers murmured again, realizing that the girl's innocence had always been her greatest power. As the dawn crept across the horizon, painting the sky with shades of gold, the scene transformed. The chains that bound the guilty glowed faintly in the morning light, but the girl stood untouched. Her scars, though fresh, became marks of survival rather than defeat. Every bruise was proof that she had endured, every wound a sign that cruelty had failed. The villagers slowly began to rally around her. Some offered food and water, others reached out with gentle hands as if afraid she might vanish. Children peeked at her from behind their mothers, their wide eyes filled with wonder. For them, she was no longer just the girl who scrubbed floors or carried heavy loads, she was a living lesson, a story that would be told long after they grew old. The elders gathered and spoke in hushed tones, but their conclusion was clear. The girl would never again live under her stepmother's roof. She had earned her place in the village as one blessed by fate. Her innocence saved her, one elder declared. And innocence blessed by spirits is stronger than any chain. The stepmother's humiliation grew heavier as the villagers turned from her. Once she had commanded respect with her sharp tongue and false smiles. Now she was a prisoner of her own malice, bound by the very weapon she had chosen to destroy the girl. The irony was sharp, undeniable. The girl, scarred but free, looked to the sky as the sun rose. A soft breeze lifted her hair, carrying with it the whispers of unseen forces that had stood by her side in the darkest night. She breathed deeply, and for the first time in years the air did not taste of fear. Though her journey of healing had only begun, she knew one truth: cruelty could wound the body but it could not break the spirit. The chains had not destroyed her, they had revealed her strength. The villagers would carry the lesson in their hearts, whispering it to their children and grandchildren. The stepmother would live with her shame, remembered not for her power but for her downfall. And the girl, no longer a silent sufferer, would walk forward into her new life, free at last, her innocence shining brighter than any chain could ever bind.